So thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I didn't know the Democratic Committee was controlling the screens, but apparently the power knows no end. Okay, so I want to start at a place that I think many people are, with a certain fear of the scary time we're in. Scary time for democracy. Some are scared of what just happened in Britain and what looks like it won't be happening in Britain. Some are scared of what's happening in the United States, either on the Republican or Democratic side. Some are even scared of Hillary Clinton, but none of those fears scare me. What scares me is this growing skepticism of democracy. I've had colleagues say to me, what's wrong with the, quote, people? How could they be so stupid? A kind of elite sneer in the middle of this populist moment has begun to define our reflection on where we are. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm no populist. As a Harvard law professor, I make the elite for a living, right? But my view is that this response is obtuse and oblivious, and it misses a really critical flaw that is at the core of our democracy right now. And I want to give you a metaphor to help us grab the part this obtuseness misses. Imagine this sad boy, sad because of something his parents are doing. Now, of course, this couldn't be my child, and I'm sure none of you have children who would be suffering in this particular way. I just hear there are people out there with children who treat their children in this way, oblivious to the child as they focus on the machine. And after a while, after the obliviousness grows, there's a certain reaction, an explosion by the child. And when the child explodes, there's an astonishment by the parent. An astonishment that says, what is the matter? This is not how we should respond. But actually, of course, the child has a point. Because while we are distracted, while one is distracted, he gets impatient, frustrated, and at a certain point explodes, and we could say for good reason, he explodes. Now, there's something misleading in that metaphor. I want to flag it right now. It's written as if we think about the elite and the peasants, the child, the children being the democracy. That's not my point. Instead, I want to emphasize the betrayal in that picture. The betrayal of this most important love, this betrayal practice as this child feels betrayed. And think about how in that story parents find a way back to the connection that avoids the explosion that we can predict that child inevitably will have. Because I think the same dynamic is happening with our democracy right now. America's in the middle of many changes, many insecurities spread throughout our society, but also there is a betrayal by our representatives. Representatives who the public thinks don't listen, don't respond. Representatives whose confidence has collapsed. This confidence rating in Congress finds Congress's confidence rating just about bouncing at the margin of error. It could be 0 for all we know, according to this Gallup poll. And that betrayal breeds a certain frustration. And my suggestion is that frustration, at a certain point, explodes. And it explodes and expresses itself in the dynamic that we've seen here in America, and maybe also the dynamic in Britain. Now, this unresponsiveness is easy to track. At its core, it comes, I want to suggest, not from money in politics, some abstract, geeky idea of campaign finance reform. It comes from a more fundamental flaw that we have allowed an unrepresentative democracy to become the democracy we live within. Now, conservatives often, when you use the word democracy, say, you know, we don't have a democracy. Ours was to be a republic. They like a font more like that, a republic. The framers gave us a republic, and that's true. But the thing this criticism ignores is that by a republic, what they meant was a representative democracy. But what we have now is an representative democracy. The unrepresentativeness, the unness is obvious, and we can see it in three different places. We can see it first in the way we've allowed an unequal freedom to vote to evolve within our political system. The Brennan Center did an amazing study after the 2014 election, and they found that more than 10 million people had to wait 30 minutes or more to vote. Now, of course, if you are relatively affluent with childcare and an iPhone, you might think, okay, what is 30 minutes to vote? But for others without childcare or with multiple jobs or without something to distract them, this is in effect a poll tax. A poll tax that much of working America cannot afford, producing an unequal vote. And now also we've tied that to the unequal weight that different people's votes have in the system of democracy we've allowed to evolve. We can think of something called safe seat gerrymandering-ism. Jerryism here, right? This great article by Christopher Ingraham at the Washington Post describes these crimes against geography, the increasing practice of our Congress to craft districts in the United States designed to protect incumbents or to determine the results between the two parties in the particular state. So that right now, out of 435 representatives, there are at most 90 competitive seats in the United States Congress, which means that there are 89 million Americans who are effectively unrepresented in our Congress because they happen to be in the minority party in a safe seat district, which means that their representative has no reason ever to worry about their views because their vote could never matter to electing that representative or not. And then in addition to this safe seat gerrymanderingism, we have a structure of the districts which destroys anything close to proportional representation. In 2012, in the Northeast, which of course is a predominantly blue section of the country, 40% of the votes went to Republicans, but 0 seats went to the Republicans. And the same thing happens the other way around. In Pennsylvania in 2012, there were 2.7 million votes for Democrats, 2.6 million votes for Republicans. But because of the way the districts were gerrymandered, the Democrats got 7 seats and the Republicans got 12 seats, completely undermining the relationship between the representative public and how our Congress is constructed, this unequal representation. But most critical, in my view, most dramatic in this inequality, is the unequal status people have as citizens. Now, you might think, what could that mean, unequal status? And I want to show you a clear example. I want to say that it's common in political history, that it's current, and that it's deeply corrupt. So here's the clear example. 1923, Texas passed a law. And that law said that in the Democratic primary, only whites were permitted to vote. By law, this all-white primary excluded African Americans from this critical first stage of the election. So there's 2 stages to that election. In the first stage, the whites vote, and in the second stage, anyone who has registered can vote. So to run in that general election, you had to do very well in that white primary. There's 2 stages which produced a filter, the consequence of which is obviously to produce a democracy responsive to whites only. As citizens, Whites mattered more than African Americans. The unequal status they had as citizens was manifest. And astonishingly, it took the Supreme Court more than 40 years to finally find a way to articulate the reason why that inequality should not be permitted. Now, you might think this is a special case way in our past, but in fact, this practice, this design, this democracy-defeating device has been common throughout our history. And it's invented by maybe the greatest political philosopher of the 19th century, a man named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed used to say, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. Because what Boss Tweed recognized is that if you could control the nomination, the first stage through which a candidate must pass in order to get elected, you could be sure you controlled the candidate, because the next election, the candidate would once again worry first. Have I kept Boss Tweed happy? So any system where you have this filter, this nominating election where Tweeds could be controlling it, produces this consequence, obviously, of a system responsive to the Tweeds only. This, I want to give the name, the bizarre name, the unfamiliar name, but it's cute anyway. Tweedism. That's that type of design. And when you think about Tweedism, you begin to recognize, you begin to see it everywhere. Think about the fight that broke out in Hong Kong about a year and a half ago, where Hong Kong confronted this extraordinary protest, a protest led by students, literally high school and college students, and then eventually their parents felt guilty, so they showed up as well. A protesting a law which China had required Hong Kong to enact, a law that said the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Okay, so a nominating committee that would pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong got to vote among. Now, this nominating committee had about 1,200 people, which out of a population of 7 million means 0.02% of Hong Kong were to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong got to vote among. Now, as you can see quite clearly, 0.02% is a tiny number, right? There it is, barely visible on that screen. If you thought about it relative to all of the population of Hong Kong, this is what 0.02% looks like, tiny, tiny fraction that gets to select the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote among. You had to run in that election, you had to do well in the nominating committee. And the fear was this filter would be a biased filter, because the 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. Not an all-white primary, we could think of it as an all-red primary, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only. Okay, all of those examples are clear, I think. None of us would look at those examples and say that's a healthy, well-functioning democracy. None would think that's a system that represents the people that the elected representatives are intended to represent. So let's then consider this final example, which I call corrupt. We take it for granted in the United States that campaigns will be privately funded. But funding is its own contest. We could think of funding as its own primary. Funding of campaigns takes time. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars, calling people around the country, raising the money they need to get their party back into power or to get themselves reelected. B.F. Skinner gave it this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is a picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns which buttons he or she must push to get the sustenance he or she needs to survive. This life has an effect on members of Congress. As they live that life, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, this is a primary too. It's the money primary. Not a white primary, but the green primary. The first stage in a multi-stage process that the candidate must clear in order to be a candidate that can run and be elected. Because to run in that voting election, you must do well in this green primary. So if this is the structure, we should think about who the funders are. Well, we could think first about the biggest funders. Those are large, those big funders. In 2014, the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million. In the first part of this presidential cycle, a tiny, tiny number, 158 families, had given over half the money that had been contributed to the presidential election cycle at that point. And in the super PACs, half of the money is coming from just 50 donors. These are the biggest funders. But I don't think that's the important kind of funder to think about here. Instead, I think the relevant funders that we should think about are those who give enough, whose contributions are big enough to matter to the member of Congress as the member of Congress is calling or thinking about who to call to raise the money he or she needs to get elected. So what is that number? How big is big enough to matter? Well, if you're very conservative, because most people would think this number is just too small to matter, but if you're very conservative, let's pick the number $5,200, which in 2012 was the maximum amount you could give to one congressional candidate in the primary and general election. So if you thought that was the number, that was the most that you had to give so that you mattered, these are the relevant funders. It turned out in 2012 there were 57,874 funders of these relevant funders. And if you are doing the math, you know that 57,874 is about 0.02% of America. 0.02% dominating this first stage in this two-stage process to elect the candidates who will serve in Congress, this tiny fraction of the 1%. We could say a Chinese fraction of the 1% dominate this first stage with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to funders only. How do we know that? Well, there's a study by Princeton, which is a Harvard professor. I don't talk about much, so I'll put it off the stage quickly, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of the actual decisions of our government in the history of political science, relating those actual decisions to the attitudes of the economic elite, the attitudes of organized interest groups, and the attitudes of the average voter. And what they found was a pretty stark correlation with the attitudes of the economic elite. What this is saying is, as the percentage of the economic elite who supports something goes from 0 to 100%, the probability of that proposal becoming law goes up. That's the intuition we would have. The more who support something, the more likely it is it will pass. Same thing with organized interest groups. The more who support something, the higher the probability that it was, in fact, actually enacted. Remember, again, these are actual policy decisions our government had taken. Okay, so here's the graph for the average voter. A flat line, literally and figuratively. What that's saying is, it doesn't matter the percentage of the average voter who supports something. It doesn't change the probability of that thing actually being enacted. As the authors described when they put it in English, when the preferences of the economic elite and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. Right, here's the picture that we had of what our democracy would be. There we are, we the citizens, kind of middle America right here, driving the bus. That's the idea of a representative democracy. Here's the reality of this representative democracy. The steering wheel has become detached from the bus. We don't have a system where the people actually, in fact, nor do they perceive that they are steering the bus. And that reality, that unrepresentativeness, that unresponsiveness, I suggest accounts for a large part of the frustration that we see manifested in the behavior that we've seen in the democracies in this election cycle. We built this. this unresponsive, unequal, unrepresentative democracy, we built this. And what we should do as we think about this thing we built is, what could possibly go wrong, right? What could possibly go wrong in a democracy where the people don't feel that their views actually matter? Well, what goes wrong for the democracy is what goes wrong for this kid. The frustration and anger explodes at some point. And democracy must decide what then it should do. That's the problem. Here's the good news about this problem. This is the part most people miss. It's completely fixable. Completely, obviously, simply fixable. It takes 279 votes to fix it. That's 278 plus 1. 1 is the president, or 218 in the House, 60 in the Senate, plus 1. That's the president. This is a nice framing of this new group. Start by Richard Green, called the 279 Project, trying to build support for fundamental changes through aggregating the number of votes it's going to take. 279 could pass one statute that would fix the unrepresentativeness of this democracy. We could fix it, or more precisely, they could fix it. They could fix it first by fixing the unequal freedom to vote that we have. And this is the most familiar change, is something people are talking about all the time, to make voting equally easy, to move voting to a holiday, for example, or to fund technology equally so that districts with technology suffer the same burden as opposed to the current reality where districts happening to be in the minority party for a state suffer more from the burdens of inadequate technologies than districts with the majority party. So that part's easy, that part's obvious. That's been discussed by Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in this election cycle often, to restore the equal opportunity of people to vote, to make it equally free for people to vote. Second, something most people don't recognize, we could easily in a single statute fix the equal weight that our vote has, fix the gerrymandering problem. The Fair Vote Project has developed a statute, a model legislation, which Congress could enact through power granted in the Constitution, which would recraft the way congressmen were elected, just like Congress has done many times in the history of our Congress, achieving effectively proportional representation in the House in a single statute without changing anything that happens in the state's redistricting process. This is possible by power granted in the Constitution. But third and most important to me is to fix the unequal citizenship produced by this crazy way we've allowed campaigns to be funded. Because if the problem with our system for funding campaigns is the unrepresentative funding, if the problem is the Tweeds are dominating the process of funding the campaigns, the solution is to achieve representative funding, to achieve a system where it's not just the tiniest fraction of the 1% who are most important in the funding equation, but in fact everyone who has a representative role in the funding. And that can be achieved through bottom-up public funding of congressional campaigns, an idea which both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have expressly endorsed, through either vouchers, which we give to every voter to help them fund small-dollar campaigns, or matching systems which match and multiply small contributions to make it possible for candidates to run winning campaigns without depending on large contribution, and to make it so members of Congress are dependent on all of us, not just on those of you who are called upon constantly to fund their campaigns. And the clearest example of a statute that would achieve this is John Sarbanes' Government by the People Act, which now has more than 170 co-sponsors in the House, and which, if passed, would radically change the economy of how campaigns are funded. All this is possible if we could only imagine Congress having the will to enact it. But I'm afraid that's where the good news comes to an end. Because in fact, we've evolved to a place where there's almost no will to enact it. 2016 was an election cycle which saw the best of times and the worst of times for this issue. Donald Trump kicked off his campaign by calling out the corrupting influence of money in politics, by declaring himself independent of that corrupting influence, by saying he would fund his own campaign, and by attacking super PACs and saying he would not accept super PAC funding from anyone until he met this man, Sheldon Adelson, and now is openly courting large contributions, just like the people he was attacking in the Republican primary. Bernie Sanders, of course, made the issue of money central in his presidential campaign, but he used the issue primarily just to attack Hillary Clinton. And in that attack, her response, I believe, should have been to say, hey, Bernie, we all know it's not the president that's the problem, it's Congress. It's the corrupt Congress that makes it so this government can't function, and that's where the corrupting influence of money is having its effect, not on the president, but on the Congress. So grab the issue and spin it around and direct it right at the reform that actually would fix the problem. But instead of that, her response was essentially to say, show me the corruption. Show me where I've made a decision that's been driven by the money. Basically, the argument the Supreme Court made in Citizens United when the Supreme Court said we have no clear showing of corruption in these cases. Now, this issue has all but been forgotten in the debates about what this presidential election is going to be about. Indeed, the Democratic Platform Drafting Committee, when it concluded and announced all of its fantastic work outlining the issues that will be central to the platform, did not even mention the problem of money in politics or the solutions that they eventually, I think, in the platform will embrace, because they perceive, as I think we have to perceive, this issue is not relevant to the politicians who are running the campaigns. What we need is to find a way to fix our democracy first. That becomes increasingly, I think, obvious to all except to those with the power to actually fix it. I think we need to recognize we've got something like an innovator's dilemma going on here for politics. Remember Clay Christensen's fantastic work that describes how a company cannot innovate to the next great platform or technology, cannot innovate itself, because it will never seem sensible for the company itself to cannibalize its own process for something new. We depend on the outsider to do that. Well, there's an equivalent reformer's dilemma going on here. Reform will never make sense to the insiders. So the change will not come from the inside. But then for us, the question is who? How? Where will it come from? What's the institution? What is the institution in our government that could fix Congress? Congress? Congress will not fix itself. The president will not take on Congress and force Congress to fix itself. The court has no power to force Congress to fix itself. No institution in our government has the power to force Congress to fix this problem. So the question is who? Should it be the professors? No, I don't believe it should be the professors. What I think is something a little bit insane, it seems a little insane, especially at this point. What I think is we have to find a way to bring the people into the process of fixing this corruption. We need a way to bring the people in, to make it true and to make it seem to them that we actually have something like a representative democracy because they representative. Their views representative, have been included in this process. But that seems so incredibly hard for us. We live in a time when democracy without professionals does not seem possible. We seem stuck in a place that the only people who can do policy, government policy, are the people we elect, and if that's true, we have a real problem if the people we elect cannot fix this problem. So let me tell you a story about a different place. I'm not sure how many people have gone to the magical place of Iceland. They have elves there, which is where the gold is held there. Bizarre fact, 70% of Icelanders believe there are elves in Iceland, so it must be true, right? So Iceland has had an incredible experience in the past 8 years with democracy. In 2008, after the collapse, the economic collapse, brought down their government and brought down their economy. There was an incredible protest called the Pots and Pans protest, where tens of thousands of people showed up outside of Parliament banging pots and pans, demanding reform. And what began to be recognized by those protesters was that there was a need to reclaim their government. And there began a process of crowdsourcing a constitution. Now, this crowdsourced constitution initially begins just by citizens building website that they were beginning to gather information to begin the process of drafting a constitution, because it turns out Iceland doesn't have its own constitution. It has a constitution given to it by the Danes just after World War II. But when Parliament saw this happening, Parliament decided it needed to co-opt the process. So it marked a series of steps that the constitution drafting process should go through, and it invited the citizens to go through those steps. And the first step was to gather 1,000 randomly selected Icelanders to meet together to identify the values that they thought the Constitution should respect. So 1,000 people in a population of 300,000 gathered together and discussed what the values should be and came up with a list of principles that the Constitution should embody. And then they ran an election where 525 people ran for the privilege of serving on the commission that would actually draft the Constitution. And 25 of those people were elected. And those 25, a mix between some academics, some lawyers, some people with government experience, other people who were farmers, no one with any particular government experience at all, spent 4 months drafting their Constitution. Now, it turns out our framers also took 4 months to draft our Constitution, but unlike the framers, the Icelanders posted their drafts to Facebook as they did it. And those drafts were commented upon in this ongoing feedback by people around the world who criticized particular formulations, gave other ideas for stuff to be included, which eventually, at the end of the 4 months, produced a draft, a beautiful, short Constitution, which as a constitutional scholar, a comparative constitutional scholar, I think is among the best drafted constitutions in the world. And then that was ratified. 2/3 of Iceland voted in a national referendum to ratify that constitution, the most extraordinary citizen-drafted constitution ever in the history of constitutions. This had never happened in the history of the world before. And then Parliament blocked it, refused to adopt that constitution. And right now in Iceland, there's a struggle as an election is coming up in the fall, and the parties that would implement the constitution are now leading in the polls and will probably be elected and finally ratify that constitution. Now that process, the idea of the people claiming back their right to be their own governors and crafting the document that would do it, that process is, I think, to us completely alien, even though, in some sense, in 1787, we were Iceland. We were the first nation in the history of the world to ratify a constitution through a popular process in conventions in the states. We were Iceland, but now that seems so removed from what's possible for a nation. Now, I don't think that we need a new constitution in America, or at least I'd say if we do need a new constitution, we're not ready to draft it. But I do think we need to make a start with a much smaller problem. If the problem in our current government is a problem of representation, is a problem with the fact we've allowed a system of representation to evolve which is not representative, that a representative democracy is unrepresentative, then in addressing that problem, I think we should copy Iceland about this particular narrow question, about equal representation. For imagine a series of conventions convened in the way that Iceland did its process. Let's imagine a series of conventions with 300 people randomly selected, so it's representative, who are given the information, the background, and the opportunity to deliberate and to decide how to establish in this democracy, again, the idea of equal citizens. And after a series of these conventions, gives us an opportunity to see what we, in a very precise, representative sense, believe about this ideal of representativeness and lets us tell the politicians through the progress, through the product of this work, that they should put their telephones down and listen to us and to lead us. Now, I don't know how to get there. I don't know whether it's possible. God knows I've thrown myself off of many cliffs in the cause to trigger the change that I think might get us there. God knows those have not yet worked. And I won't pretend these were painless, that I was unbroken or unscarred, but I will defend the idea that what we need is more opportunities for crazy ideas to fix this problem. We need more experiments. We need the norms to support more big and bold Silicon Valley-sized experiments to try and fail happily to address this core problem, because this betrayal by our representatives will defeat us. We will solve no issue sensibly, no issue that we care about, whether it's the craziness of guns or climate change, whether it's our tax system or debt, whether it's the behavior or the scope of the military, whatever the problem is, we will not solve it sensibly until we do fix this core corruption. So this problem that I'm talking about, I don't think is the most important problem. It's just the first problem. It's the first problem we must solve if we are to have the capacity to solve these others that we know as a nation we must find a way to solve. Let me end with one final story. So in the course of the last fall's campaign, I came across an article which I can't find again, so I can't give you an exact quote, but it's an article about a soldier who lost his life in the Middle East. And in the article is a story about a letter he had written to his child before he lost his life. And the letter was explaining why he was away. What was he away for? And in the letter, he said something like, I do this for your freedom. I do this for our democracy. Now, as I read that, what struck me was really how crazy it is to imagine that these interventions are for our freedom or our democracy. Not that it's impossible, but the link is so tenuous. It's so removed. I don't doubt that the soldier believed it, and I respect deeply the commitment, the patriotism that led him to do what he did and the sacrifice which he made. And I understood it as a kind of expression of love, a love for his country, that's the obvious, but a love for his child too. His view, however implausible, that this intervention, this effort by him would have the consequence of saving our democracy, preserving our freedom, was an act that deserves our incredible respect. But it's that same sacrifice, that same type of sacrifice that we have to find a way to motivate with us now, to find a way to build a more plausible, a more obviously connected movement to saving our democracy and our freedom. Because obviously, the commitment, the plausible commitment to doing that is what it means to love our country and to love our children. This is the first generation that will pass to our children a less well-functioning democracy than the one we inherited. This is on us. And so when I thought of his love, his sacrifice for his country and his child, I ask myself, do you have that love too? The willingness not to make that kind of sacrifice, if you have that commitment, that's extraordinary too, but a smaller sacrifice, the willingness to step outside of what is comfortable in this politics, to commit to an idea to reforming the core innovation of our republic, that it would represent citizens and represent them equally. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm happy to take some questions. Yes, sir, right here. There's a microphone that I think they're going to run to you, right there.
Sir. My name is Greg Amadon. Can we get copies of your presentation?
Sure. Yeah, I recorded it. I'm sure we'll figure out a way to make it available. Yeah. That technically, well, that's a good question. That's an easy question to answer. Right back here.
Fred, you could go back at any point in the last 200 years and make a number of the arguments that you've made, and yet American democracy has probably been the greatest force for good in the history of the human race. Isn't it really a failure of leadership in our current democracy that we can't actually solve our problems the way we have at other points in our lifetime successfully? And I'm puzzled by your conclusions, because you should love Donald Trump. I mean, Barack Obama ran against Hillary Clinton. He was nobody from nowhere. He won. It wasn't because he had all the money and the power. It was because he had the best message and he was the best candidate. Donald Trump has pointed out the amazing flaws in the institutional political class in this country, just as you have, and ran successfully to achieve more votes than any Republican in history in the primaries.
As I did not. Okay.
No, you did. You pointed out the failure of the institutional, leadership of both parties. I mean, and not to go on, but when the Republicans have had the microphone for the last 4 years, what have they chosen to talk about? Gay marriage, religious freedom, inheritance tax reform. When the Democrats have the microphone, what do they choose to talk about? Climate change, income inequality, teachers' unions. Half of the country is rightly saying, what are you guys talking about? The issues are jobs, economic growth, national security, and sensible immigration reform. But none of our parties talk about that because they're pandering to the orthodoxy that you have rightly pointed out, the donor base, wedge issues, right? Those are the issues that get their base fired up. But Trump is winning because he's not talking about those things and not doing those things. Well, he's just doing it very inarticulately.
Yeah, so I got in a lot of trouble with my Democratic friends early in the campaign when I would say basically this fact about Donald Trump. Early in the campaign, when Donald Trump was constantly attacking the role of big money in politics, pointing out how representatives could not be independent if they were dependent on these large contributions, and that we couldn't have a system that was actually producing the public good if all of the members of Congress and the president were dependent on big money. I praised that. I thought that was exactly right. I thought that was the biggest gift to the reform movement since Richard Nixon, because what it did was make it possible for people on both sides of the aisle to begin to talk about the corrupting influence of money in politics. If we have a difference about Donald Trump today, it's just, I don't think the recent behavior suggests that he's serious about it. If in fact he criticized Jeb Bush because Jeb Bush was getting $1 million contributions from people, he said you couldn't trust Jeb Bush to think about the public interest when there's $1 million contributor on the other side. What about a $100 million contributor on the other side? Right? So if he were genuine in those views that he expressed in August and September, I don't think he would be as easily forgetting the fact that these outside contributions matter. But that's not really the point. I think the most important part of your question, you said, does it depend on leadership? It does. But here's the point. Leadership of whom? We are so used to thinking leaders are the people who go to Washington. They're the politicians, the people we elect. Those are the leaders. But the most important moments in Americans' history have come when people outside of government, outside of politics, have stepped up and become leaders, citizens. Citizenship is a public role. It's a public duty. And what I'm saying is we have an incredible weakness on that side that we've got to find a way to remedy, because the only way we will force that system to change is if we can find the pressure, the leadership outside that system to push it. So I'm eager to come to talk to a group like this, because this is the group that I think have to become leaders, not by running for Congress or running for the Senate or running for the presidency, but by beginning to be citizens who say, this is not acceptable anymore. And we insist, demand, we use whatever resource we can to bring about the change we see as necessary. So we agree about an interpretation of what happened in 2016. I just don't see it anymore. But I think more fundamentally, we agree leadership is necessary. So who should those be? And I think we got to recognize that when our country was founded, there were a bunch of people who didn't want to be politicians, who thought they had to step up and do something. We need those people today. Yeah, right here.
Larry Height. I think what you need to do, if you're talking to an audience like this, is give us a place to send a check. That's what you got to do to get it started.
Yeah, so I'm grateful you would say that. I was thinking as I came here that I was so happy to come speak this time and not be in a place where I was trying to raise money for anybody. So I felt a certain liberation in feeling the integrity of being able to just tell you what I believe without raising money for a particular group. Now, I can tell you who I think you should send money to, and they're not going to be politicians, but I do think it's important not just to think that your check is enough. It's your leadership. This is a great point that was made before. It's your leadership. And your leadership is your check. That's great. But it's more building a common recognition that this system can't continue the way it is, and we have to build a common understanding that will drive it to change. And maybe they'll invite me back again, and maybe when they do, I'll have a place for you to send your check. You know.
Hi, my name's Scott. I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 12th District of Pennsylvania, very gerrymandered place. I don't think we necessarily want to start drawing straight lines through Pennsylvania's congressional districts like our borders out here. But what solution do you have or colleagues that have to potentially fix the problem with gerrymandering, if it is a problem?
It's a huge problem. And there's a great book with a terrible title because it's a kind of obnoxious title. And so the title is, if you see it printed on the book, it's RATF and then asterisk, asterisk, KING, which is a statement that the Watergate people used to describe what they were doing to the Democratic Party. But this is a fantastic book describing the game of gerrymandering right now, which has been empowered by technology in a way that nobody would have imagined even 20 years ago. And with this technology, the party in power in states where the party in power draws the districts can perfectly map districts to guarantee control in a way that doesn't waste any of their votes and produces the kind of lopsided result that I showed you in Pennsylvania. Again, Pennsylvania is a state that votes blue, but has the vast majority of its representatives as Republican. And it's the same thing in the Northeast, the other way around. Now, the alternative system is to commit to a technology that is narrow in the values that it's trying to maximize for. So you say draw districts that have equal population, but for example are compact, or that respect natural township borders or county borders. And you plug whatever parameters you want into the machine will draw the districts. And what Fair Vote has described in the project they've advanced is a system to produce districts that would be compact and relatively, they wouldn't appear gerrymandered at all, but the key insight they have is something that the framers of our Constitution did, which was to have multiple member districts, where a district would have more than one member. They propose 5 members in most districts. And in an election, you would vote for your representatives, and there would be a ranked choice voting system so that it would pick representatives, those 5 representatives, according to the ranked choice of the people voting. That system would mathematically basically produce a proportional representative system. And the districts wouldn't be as important because of the way the proportionality system, this ranked choice voting system, would work. So it's not difficult to imagine how it's done. What's really difficult is to imagine how we resist the ability of the technology to build these districts right now, which are radically unrepresentative because their objective is basically to entrench the party in power. These technologies use every single bit of data there is about you, from your activities online to your voting behavior to your consuming behavior to your advertising behavior. All of this data together is then used to build this big sort that enables them to draw these districts in a way that radically undermines the equal representativeness of these different, of people in the House of Representatives. There's a question up here.
Thank you, that was marvelous. I'm Doran Pennell, and I'm at Duke University and actually got to take constitutional law from Walter Dellinger.
Wow.
So he's amazing. What you have to say is brilliant. And as Larry says, send money, but I would say we need to get the word out. And one of the best ways now to get the word out is to get that presentation on Facebook and have us pass it around. The young people that are the movers and shakers to make things better would help. The other thing I'll say is just recently in North Carolina, and we have a lot of problems, we have HB2, but the Supreme Court just outlawed, and we had to redistrict some of the gerrymandering that went on, so it can be done.
It can be done, and the challenge, though, to do it on the state level is we don't have any good Supreme Court jurisprudence for eliminating political gerrymandering. If it's racial gerrymandering, it's pretty easy. And if it's not proportional, if you don't have districts of the same size, it's pretty easy. But the court has not yet given a clear test for political gerrymandering. There's a good chance they will. There's a really grotesque case going up to the Supreme Court right now where the court might actually articulate political gerrymandering standard that makes it possible to attack. North Carolina is a terrible state for this. Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those are the worst. But again, the solution that Fair Vote's pushing, that I think is a fantastic idea, is to work from Congress, not from the states. So Congress can create its own districts. States can create their own districts, but the districts for congressmen can be drawn by Congress. And Congress can achieve equal representation and some respect for producing proportionality through its own statutory process. And
how do we get you to make that presentation to Congress and the president?
Well, every time they invite me, I come. So that's not very often. But the other point that you make is, you're absolutely right. It is how to get the message out. But more than that, I think it's how to get the message out in a way people begin to see there's something that can be done about it. And this, again, plugs into the point I was making about how we just think the politicians are the only people who can do anything about it. So we just resign ourselves to these races where we get excited about the latest Superman or Superwoman, but without realizing that they're inside the system, and the innovator's dilemma, the reformer's dilemma, will capture them too. Yeah, right here.
My name is Bill Lockhart. Two questions. The first one would be, to the extent you fixed representativeness of elections for congressional members, do you worry that that puts voting power back into the hands of people who can be so easily swayed by emotion or fear? So you sort of referred to Brexit, but there's an argument there that it was not just frustration, but the misleading of an uninformed populace. And the question part two is there a definition of a person problem in here too? I've always wanted to ask this of a constitutional scholar, how corporates got and retain the ability to be defined as persons under US law. But there are two kinds of influences I'd be really worried: persuading an uninformed populace and allowing for a corporate voice.
Yeah, so with respect to the populist concern, I don't believe a representative democracy is utopia. And I'm sure it will decide many things that I think are fundamentally wrong. So the argument for representative democracy is not an argument for a particular set of results. It's an argument for a process that brings people into the political process when they disagree with the results. Right now, most people, most Americans, have no desire to participate in the political process. In 2014, it was the lowest turnout in the history, modern history, for voters. Why? Well, it's easy for people to look at the voters and say, see, they don't care, or they're too lazy, or they're too distracted. But I actually look at the voters and say, they're behaving rationally. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they do. I mean, when I showed you the 89 million Americans who live in congressional districts where they are in the minority party and their vote couldn't matter, why would they show up? What's the reason to? So if you got a representative system and the government wasn't doing what you thought the government should be doing, then there'd be an argument. You ought to show up and vote. You ought to show up and do something about it. You ought to express yourself. You ought to listen. You ought to focus on what the right thing should be. So that's the structure that democracy must believe in. If there were another alternative that I had any confidence in, I'd be willing to consider it, but every other alternative seems to me inevitably, ultimately, always to produce the destructive problems of concentrated power. And this system that we've got right now, crony capitalism and the corruption that produces, is producing a government that cannot address our most basic problems. It's completely stalemated at the level of Congress. So I embrace democracy not because I'm confident in what the people will do, but I embrace democracy because I think that's the process that brings the best out of what the people could do. As to who people are, there's this slogan among us reformers, corporations are not persons, money is not speech. I don't buy either of those slogans. I think they're both kind of irrelevant to the problem. It is true that the Supreme Court has created constitutional protection for corporations that seems a little bizarre. And in particular, domains like the First Amendment, it's producing increasingly weird results where governments cannot regulate corporations to, basic regulations like, even notices. I'm involved right now litigating a case on behalf of Berkeley where cell phone companies are suing Berkeley because Berkeley wanted certain notices to be included on cell phones when they're sold in the state, and the corporation says, this is our speech, we are persons, we can speak, and you're forcing us to speak, and that's the same thing as forcing somebody to say this Pledge of Allegiance, so therefore it's unconstitutional. I think that's crazy, but it's not really the core of the problem here. And the same thing with the money is speech stuff. I think money is speech. I think the idea that the government could ban you from spending your money to speak without giving a very good reason to do that is really troubling. Because I think that if you gave government that power, the government would use it to protect the incumbents or to protect itself from criticism. So I don't think either of those two constitutional slogans is actually what the problem is. And when I talk about, you notice I didn't even mention Citizens United in the whole of what I'm talking about, because I think that we are so distracted by the mess, the problems which the Supreme Court has created, that we miss the elephant in the room, which is the way we fund campaigns. That's the core problem to solve. And if we solve that, certainly there may be constitutional problems that also have to be addressed. But I think the first problem is to get us back to a place where we feel like our government's being responsive to us. Right here.
I had a question about, there's a kind of political corruption that I think would actually work well on your list. There's a monopoly that's been formed in the Republican Party through the tax pledge. And you couldn't do that kind of monopoly on political capital economically. It'd be a monopoly problem. If you had a business that cornered the market on a certain and price fixed. Isn't that really what's going on? Because in Congress, they horse trade with, cutting taxes, doing spending, and if you tie one hand behind the back of all the Republicans in Congress, where they can never agree to raise taxes, isn't that sort of limiting the political commerce of sorts?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't like that pledge. And I don't like the idea of congressmen making pledges. I think the job of a representative is to be a representative and that's not a delegate. That's somebody who's actually acting in the interest of the district. I think making pledges like that restricts that. But I wouldn't say that that problem is a problem because of the pledge. I think it's a problem because it's playing into the obvious way in which money is being attracted into the political process, right? There are Democrats and Republicans disagree about a lot of things, but the one thing rich Democrats and rich Republicans whether they say it or not, agree about. I mean, not, I'm not saying everybody, but is the tax, the burden on taxes. And so this is a cheap way for Congress to incentivize people to give money into the system. When Republicans talk about simplifying the tax code, that simplification is almost impossible in a world where they depend on private contributions to fund their campaigns, because it's the complexities in the tax code that give people incentives to fund congressional campaigns. There's this whole series, the Wall Street Journal did this piece about temporary tax provisions. Temporary tax provisions are provisions that last for 2 years and then expire, and they have to be reenacted. And the Journal was puzzled because the number of these temporary provisions is skyrocketing. And they were asking, why are these temporary provisions becoming so common? And it turns out they were first invented by Ronald Reagan when he wanted to introduce the research and development tax credit. And there was a real debate about whether it would work. And so the Democrats and Republicans struck a deal. They say, we'll make it temporary, and then we'll ask the economists, did it work? And if the economists said it worked, we'll make it permanent. If they don't say it works, then we'll get rid of it. That temporary provision, enacted in 1981, is still with us today. It is still temporary. And the reason it's temporary is every time it's about to expire, lobbyists and congressmen go to manufacturers, people who benefit the most from this, and say, we need to raise money to extend the temporary tax provision. And they raise money and they give it into the coffers of these congressmen, and then the congressmen extend the term of the temporary tax provision. So the complexity is the lever to inducing them to.
There's an element of coercion with the tax pledge. So if you step out of line
Yep.
and you're too centrist and not conservative enough, you'll get primaried by this organization.
Yeah.
It reduces the centrism.
Yeah, it plays into, you're exactly right, and I see this is our last question. It plays into the extremism which actually the gerrymandered Congress also creates. I mean, when you have a gerrymandered Congress where most of these seats are safe seats, on both the Democrat side and the Republican side, the only thing the incumbent worries about is a challenger in the primary. And the only challenger who can win on the Republican side and the Democratic side is a more extreme challenger. So a more extreme Republican takes on a more mainstream Republican, more liberal Democrat takes on a more mainstream Democrat. And that dynamic, you're right, is fueled by this pledge, because the pledge makes it clear that you're not conservative enough for us. But it plays into the way that this has been structured to produce this polarized Congress, a Congress that can't begin to represent who we are as people. I'm grateful that you would come and resist the temptation to listen about infidelity and all the other topics that you might have heard, but thank you so much for